So I am very excited to chat with Inna Topiler as we are going to discuss common as well as uncommon causes of thyroid autoimmunity. But before we do this, let me go and give Ina's impressive bio here. So her bio here starts off by just saying that Inna Topiler Mooney is a board certified clinical nutritionist with over 17 years of experience in clinical practice. And she is the founder of an integrative practice, Complete Nutrition and Wellness. She's also the host of Health Mystery Solved, Hashimoto's and Thyroid Revealed podcast, and the educator behind the Thyroid Mystery Solved Step by Step program. As a health detective, educator, thinker outside the box, and Hashimoto's rebel, Ina loves getting to the real root of hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, and she has helped hundreds of people balance it. She knows you are struggling, and she is here to tell you that you are not alone and show you as many possible answers as she can starting right now. And thank you so much for joining us, Ina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eric. I'm so delighted to be speaking with you today.
Yeah, I am as well. I'm really excited to chat with you about some common and uncommon causes. But before we do that, let's get into your background. So, how did you start helping others with Hashimoto's?
Well, I think, like probably a lot of practitioners, it started with my own health issues. And you know what they say, if you've been in it and lived it, then you can really truly understand it. I know that very similar goes for you as well. So for me, it started in college. I was just having a lot of issues, skin issues, digestive issues, fatigue. I went on to work on Wall Street after college. It was a really fun, glamorous job. However, I did not feel glamorous at all. I was having more of the same in addition to the fatigue and the digestive issues. I started getting brain fog, a lot of hormonal imbalances, literally you name it. And I had that symptom. And I was only 22 at the time. And so I did the whole rounds of doctors. I saw different primaries. I saw an endocrinologist, a gastroenterologist, a gynecologist, a dermatologist. But none of these doctors were actually speaking to each other. Instead, they really almost kind of like blamed me, and then I blamed myself, and there was no answers. And then finally, after rounds and rounds of doctors, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And I thought, hallelujah, this is fantastic. I actually have something that they know versus your labs are normal, right? There's nothing we could do and I'm feeling crappy, right? So I said, okay, great. I have Hashimoto's. What do we do? And the doctor said, well, your thyroid itself is actually okay now. So we do nothing. And I said, okay, what do you mean we do nothing? She's like, well, your labs are in range. So we just wait and see. And we'll wait and see until eventually the Hashimoto's will destroy your thyroid because that's what happens. And then at that time, we will give you medicine and you'll have to take it forever. As you can imagine, I was not very stoked about this. And at that point, I really didn't have much of a background. I went to school originally for finance. So while I did have, a lot of science background, I didn't really have the functional medicine background. But even then, without that, I knew, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why would I just wait and see for my thyroid to get destroyed? And so that's when I started looking at more of a functional approach. I saw a clinical nutritionist who was able to show me so much of what was happening. We actually saw that even though the endocrinologist said that my thyroid was quote unquote normal, it really was not in the optimal range at all. My TSH was actually a little bit on the higher end. It was still within the lab's range, but the lab's ranges are so wide. And I'm sure this is something that you talk about quite a bit on the show, so your audience knows. But my TSH was in the fours, and ideally, you really want to be under three. And my T4 and T3 really weren't optimal. And in addition to that, though, I had parasites, I had candida, I had mercury toxicity, I had 16 amalgam fillings. Every time I say that to people, they almost can't believe that's possible. But yep, I had 16 amalgam fillings. I had all types of hormonal imbalances, um, adrenal insufficiency. There were so many different things. I had a copper toxicity as well. And as we found those things, most people would say, oh my goodness, there's so much stuff. But to me, I was excited because there was really something that we can do. And this doctor that I worked with really explained, this is because of this, and this issue is because of this, and this is how we solve it. And so for the first time, I felt like, oh my gosh, there's actually something that I could do. And then we started working on all of these things. And of course, diet was a big piece of it. I had a gluten sensitivity, which I refused to accept for a while, but then got around to it. I also have one of the celiac genes. So he really was able to put all of this kind of together so I could see this bigger picture, almost like a bird's eye view, like, oh my gosh, all of these things are off. And as I started working on it one on one, things just started to get better and better and better. And, I don't want to make it sound like it was all, you know, roses and petals and everything was just perfect right away. It was a journey and it took time. And so there a lot of times in healing there is just sort of you take one step forward, sometimes it feels like two steps back, and there was a lot of learning and a lot of figuring out, but either way there was this goal of where I needed to be, and with every trigger, if you will, or every kind of thing that we were working on, as that got better, I saw improvements both on my labs and how I felt. And it took a couple of years. It wasn't overnight, but I just saw such tremendous success. And I mean, my body then, at this point, I'm 44 now. I started this journey at 22. I feel better now at 44 than I did in 22. So it was really phenomenal. And then from there, I started to actually just help some friends, and then they told their friends, and I helped their friends. And then I decided, wait a minute, what am I doing here in finance? This is really what I want to do. And I went back to school and I did a few different programs, ended up then doing a master's and then a lot of other continuing education, and then started my practice and never looked back.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, definitely when you mentioned the 16 amalgams, that's mind blowing. Just that's pretty much half your mouth with having silver fillings. So I need to ask, did you remove all of them correctly, like going to a biological dentist or?
I did. I did. So thankfully, I realized that the fillings were an issue when I started to look into the functional medicine approach. So I was then guided, by this doctor on exactly how to do it. Because if I had found out before knowing, I probably would have gone to a conventional dentist, and then who knows, right? I still think, kind of in hindsight, that I did remove more than what my body can handle at a time. And if knowing now, I think I would have in the past removed, maybe one or two at a time versus doing a whole quadrant. And I probably would have done a little bit more prep work, but they did it in the best way that they could at the time.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. Like how many did you get removed at a time? So it sounded like you got four removed at a time, and then to have four.
It was 3 or 4, yeah, and, there was many sessions of that, and everyone is different. I think that I it's really important to optimize all the detoxification pathways before removing them. I think I was so shocked as to how many I had. I don't even think I realized I had that many. And then just coming to the realization that I have all this mercury in my mouth, and it's been in my mouth for probably, at that point, maybe like 8 or 9 years. And I was just horrified at that thought. So I wanted them out as soon as possible. And I think I myself probably rushed it a little bit because, I thought, please get all this stuff out. But I am a more sensitive person. And I find just in general, people with autoimmunity, whether it's Graves' disease or Hashimoto's, we're sort of the more sensitive people. And, pushing isn't always the best. So a little bit at a time, I find tends to go better in a long way.
So when it comes to common and uncommon causes, would I be right to say that environmental toxins, heavy metals such as mercury, are one of the more common causes, at least from what you
Absolutely.
find? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I like to divide the causes sort of in their like little buckets, and then there's many things within the buckets. And so the way I look at it is, we have the food bucket. So the things that we're eating, right? That our body may not like for whatever reason, whether because genetically we're not predisposed to it, to processing it, or because there's another type of sensitivity going on. So there's that. And then the other bucket is going to be the toxins. So whether that's toxins from the environment, food, water. So these are things like heavy metals. These are things like the pesticides that we could be exposed to, any other toxins that our liver has a hard time processing. And I think when we think about toxins, it's not necessarily how many toxins someone has or how big of a load it is, but it's what is their detoxification capacity. Because you could take two people with the same amount of exposure, say they eat the same type of fish the same amount of times a week, and yet one person can have more mercury than the other, and the same with filling. So it's just what the body can handle. So then that would be the other bucket. So we have the food, we have the toxins, and then there's the infections bucket. And, these could be all types of infections from viruses, chronic viruses such as EBV to gut infections, so candida and parasites and all types of other bacteria, H. pylori and things like that. Um, and just other types of infections, not like a common cold necessarily, but other infections that we could be exposed to. And then the fourth bucket is the stress bucket, which, I mean, we can have 5 podcasts on this, I am sure. But that's really what our nervous system is doing. So if our nervous system is upregulated, which is all of us, right, for the most part, that's going to affect us. So we also have to remember that when it comes to stress, it's not just emotional, there's the physical of stress as well. So it's the foods and the infections and the toxins, they're creating that physical stress. It's also the things like in the way that we eat. When we have blood sugar dysregulation, that's a huge stressor on the body that's more physical. So there's that piece of that bucket. And then there's the emotional piece of the stress. And it doesn't mean that people have to change their lives, right? Or that they have to quit their jobs necessarily, but it's more about finding ways to manage things. And I think really manage things on a daily basis. I always tell people it's not about, oh, you're really stressed, let's take a spa day, right? You don't want to wait until you are so stressed that you're literally about to burst from the pressure, but it's about kind of maintaining a level and really continuing to lower that nervous system. And I feel like once you lower it, then there's always a new threshold. Because I remember I was a lot more stressed than I am now, and now I look back, I'm like, "Oh, this is nothing compared to 10 years ago." But yet there's still more here, right? And so with every bit that we downregulate, there's always that next level, and I think it's striving for that.
Yeah, I agree with you as far as doing something every day. Do you recommend mind body medicine, like to do yoga on a daily basis, meditation, deep breathing?
Yes, all of those things. So, I think that it's really important to try to find something that you personally like, because yoga is amazing, but not everyone's into yoga. So if you're doing something that your body just doesn't feel comfortable doing, or you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason, it actually could be more stressful. I like breathing a lot, and I think breath work could be really, really powerful. And there's so many different ways of doing it. But as long as we're breathing in a more full way and not very shallow, just from the chest, then that's going to have a natural stress reducing ability to it. There's many different workshops on breath work, but there's even just simple things like a box breath, for example, where you breathe in for a count of, say, 5, hold for 5, breathe out for 5, and hold that for 5. I mean, most people have probably heard of that. Though, when I ask them, okay, you've heard of it, but are you doing it? They'll say, not really. But that's something we can do every time you go to the bathroom, right? I think it's pairing that with something else, because a lot of times if you don't make time for it, it's not going to happen. One of the things that I personally started doing in the more recent years is waking up a little bit earlier. So I do the miracle morning. Are you familiar with Hal Elrod? Yep. Okay.
I am.
So I love doing that. And his, for everyone listening, if you're not familiar, he has a book called The Miracle Morning, and he talks about 6 things that just overall have proven to be beneficial, and doing each of those 6 things for a few minutes in the morning. So it's meditation, it's journaling, it's reading something that's going to stimulate your mind, it's exercise, um, affirmations, and I forget those 5. What's the 6th one? Do you remember offhand?
I don't. Yeah.
Um, but it's and now I don't do all of these things every morning. Sometimes I focus more on one versus the other, but I just find in general, even if I don't do those specific things, just waking up a little bit before my kids, it's like being on offense instead of being on defense. It just your day is just it goes better. And I am a fan of really looking at what I want my day to be, or what I want something to be like, sort of like that happy end result. and really focusing on that. So, yes, I do the breathing and the journaling, all of that. But for me personally, and everyone is different, but what has worked for me is to really be mindful of how I use my imagination. So, very often, most of us will focus on what we don't want. And we're not purposely thinking about it, right? It just happens, right? So, say that we're in traffic, it's very common for our minds to start thinking and even possibly visualizing pictures of ourselves being really late for work, our boss getting angry at us, people looking at us like, why are you here 10 minutes late? Right. And then, like, all the thoughts of, oh my God, I'm going to be late. I'm going to be late. I'm going to get in trouble. If I get in trouble, then I'm not going to get this or that. Right. And really, I mean, most things that we worry about don't actually ever come to pass, but our imagination is working in that way where we're actually like spiraling down. And so if we take that and we think more of our sort of happy end results, right? Or like what it is that we want when we are, say, stuck in traffic. Yes, we could sit there and be worried and have this tension in our stomach, or we could say, okay, well, what is it that I want? Well, I want to make it to work on time, right? So, what would it take for me to make it to work on time? Sounds much lighter than, oh my gosh, I'm going to be late, right? Or what would it take for me to make it when I make it and for everything to be okay when I get there? Right. Because sometimes the traffic isn't going to go your way and then we can't. And it's just a little bit of a different kind of energy then in terms of how we think about it. And then naturally, the pictures that are going to circle around in our brain are going to be these more positive pictures. And, what I like about this is I think it's a little bit different than affirmations. And with affirmations, it's where you're saying positive statements. And there's nothing wrong with affirmations. But I find that if you say a positive statement and it doesn't resonate with you, then you almost feel like you're lying to yourself. And if someone is kind of able to sort of feel their own energy and focus on that, it feels heavy. Right. So if, let's say, you're dealing with a health issue and say that you're feeling tired, which is a really common thing for people who are dealing with thyroid issues. So if you're really, really exhausted and say you have autoimmunity and maybe you have joint pain and maybe you have some of these other things and you're told, okay, well, say an affirmation that you're healthy, right? So then someone would sit down and say, okay, I'm healthy, my body's strong. I mean, it's a nice thing to say, but then your mind, right, or your subconscious mind more so is going, no, you're not. Right. And then it's just this heavy energy. It's almost like you're fighting with yourself. And I just find that not to be helpful. But if you say it in a different way, and there's a couple of different ways, like, I'm committed to eating in a way that's going to make me feel more energized today. Sounds a little lighter, right? Or what would it take for me to feel energized today? You don't necessarily have to have an answer to that question, but just saying it that way just feels like, let me just open it up, right? Like to see what comes and how I could be in that energy of flow versus that, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I love it. And also, it's great what you mentioned and important to reinforce about blocking out time. So even if it means waking up early, like you do, like an extra few minutes, that's important because that's a big excuse people just in general have. Well, I don't have the time, and we're not saying to sacrifice an hour or two of sleep, but maybe you can make up for it in the back end. I mean, we still either way, we want you to get your sleep, but we don't want you to have an excuse not to block out time for stress management. And what I tell people is even if you start with 5 minutes per day just to get into the routine, because I'm like you, I recommend doing it every single day. And if someone thinks that they need to do it 20, 30 minutes every single day, and again, maybe that's great to do. I mean, not, I mean, that is great to do, but it could be overwhelming to to know, well, I got to block out 20 minutes 30 minutes every single day. But if you could start with 5 minutes, and everybody can find 5 minutes per day, and if they can't, then they really need to block out the time for stress management. But get in the routine, 5 minutes per day, and then once you're in the routine, you could gradually increase. At least that's what I tell my patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then once you're in a routine, you could be mindful of what you're feeling throughout the day. That's almost like the next step, right? So then if you start to feel tense, then you can actually stop yourself in the moment and kind of see, okay, well, what are the thoughts that are coming up? Right. And I'll give you an example. This morning, I had a lot of things to do and I was rushing around to finish emails and some notes and then get my kids from school and then get here to have this wonderful conversation with you. And I know, and it's Monday morning as we're recording this, and, Mondays are Mondays. There's always things to do, and I actually had a lot of beef with Mondays, back in the day, which I've really worked on clearing, and I realized a lot of that came from, my parents and kind of being like, "Oh, Monday, you gotta get ready, you gotta do all this stuff, and the week is coming, it's hard, and you have to work hard, and blah, blah, blah," and so I really worked on clearing a lot of those beliefs because all that is just a belief that you pick up as a child before you even have a logical mind. And, these are just beliefs you pick up from just other people's mannerisms. They're not your own. And so I did a lot of clearing on that. So I feel better on Mondays, overall. But I just noticed this like tension in my stomach and I'm answering my emails. I'm sitting at the computer. I'm like, what is happening? Like, why am I so tense right now? And I'm like, okay, let me stop here for a second. I'm like, all right, what's the belief here? I'm like, okay, well, I think the belief is that I need to get all of this done before 12 o'clock or else, and I have to think, okay, well, or else what? Like, what's going to happen, right? And so it's like, all right, let me just really like clear any of this belief that like something has to be done or else. And then, really look at, okay, well, what is it that I want, right? Well, I want to be able to answer the emails so people feel supported by my answer and do it in a way that's very easy and has flow to it. And so, my body's so tight, I'm not even probably writing the responses that are going to give those people like the energetic sort of answer that they need. So it's kind of seeing that in the moment and just shifting the thought. That's all it is. And then as you shift your thought, it's amazing what physically happens in the body, right? Because that energy then controls your physicality as well.
Yep, I definitely agree. So it's, yeah, not just about spending time, whether it's in the morning or later on, but yeah, that
It's
mindfulness
both.
definitely is
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think starting with something is great. So starting in the morning or the time of day just to get a routine because then you will have a very clear picture of what's calm and what's not, right? So then when you do have tension, you'll recognize it because so often people are like this, right? And all tense and they have no idea because they don't even have a baseline for what relaxed is or a new baseline. They may have an old baseline when they were even more stressed, but not a new baseline.
So let's hit the food bucket. And you mentioned
Mm.
gluten. I don't want to spend too much time with gluten just because I think a lot of listeners already know about gluten. So I really want to get your opinion about other foods that might be problematic that maybe there are certain foods across the board besides gluten, whether it's dairy. Again, that's why I'm asking here. Maybe there are foods that depend on the person. Maybe you do food sensitivity testing, but if you want to talk a little bit about gluten, but I really want to hear your thoughts about foods other than gluten that might be a problem.
Agreed. I think we all know about gluten and the celiac genes and all of the things. So we don't need to belabor that. I think with the other foods, it does depend on the person. I mean, typically, I find that dairy is an issue for a lot of people, not everyone. And some people can tolerate raw dairy. I do use food sensitivity testing, not a ton, because I just find that sometimes the results could, depending on, there's so many labs and there's so many tests that it's not that they're not accurate, they're just not looking at all the pathways. So we can respond to a food on many different pathways. And if you're checking just one pathway, say like an IgG pathway, and it's negative, that doesn't mean that you can't be responding on an IgA pathway, or, from like a cell mediated response. So that's where it's a little bit tricky. But I also think that, whether we're using testing, in terms of a lab, we can also do a trial. Like for me personally, I also refused to believe in the beginning that dairy was an issue because I love dairy. And what I have come to figure out, it took me a little while. I so wish that I figured this out earlier, but dairy would react very poorly on my skin. So I mentioned earlier that one of the biggest things that I had was acne. I mean, I had many issues, but that was probably the one that bothered me the most because I think I was in my early 20s and I was living in New York City and, I looked like I was a teenager. And I kept thinking, oh, I tried this cream. So maybe this cream made me break out, or maybe it's my period, or maybe it's this or that. And it never occurred to me that dairy was this common denominator until I did some testing. So dairy was an issue, still refused to believe it. And then finally tried it out, took it out. And then I was like, oh, I use a cream with oil and yet my skin's still okay without the dairy. So I think doing a trial, if someone isn't maybe able to afford to do a test or is not sure if their test maybe is as accurate. And typically, I'd like for people to give 3 to 4 weeks because less than that is just not enough time because that food has to leave your system. And then you can see how you feel. And it's not always a direct. For me, I was looking for more digestive issues. I didn't see any digestive changes with or without dairy. I was getting gas and bloating, but that was more of the candida and some of the other issues that I had. Not eating dairy, I was still bloated at the time because I haven't treated some of the other gut issues that I had. But the skin, it was like a night and day difference. And so someone else, it could be joint pain or it could be brain fog or it could be another symptom. So I think it's worth a try. But there's typically with autoimmunity, a lot of people do react in some way that's more negative to dairy. Lectins is another biggie. So lectins are found in grains, they're found in legumes, and it's impossible, I think, to take out all lectins just because they're everywhere and there's nightshade vegetables that are high in lectins. But I find for both myself and for many of the people that I see, doing a lower lectin diet is very helpful, especially in the beginning. The other thing with food is that we have to be careful about eliminating too many things for too long. And I think we were in the culture, and especially probably more like 10, even 15 years ago, where people would go on a very strict diet and stay in it for a long time. And we know that it's so important to diversify the foods that we eat because that really helps in terms of the diversification of the different gut microbes that we have and having that really, really nice variable microbiome. So it's not about taking out all foods and staying off of them. But I think, and especially if you're newly diagnosed or you're in a flare up of Graves or Hashimoto's or really any autoimmune disease, it helps to kind of be a little bit more strict and be, extra clean. And that's where the lectins, I think, play a really big role. And then we slowly introduce them back in as we look at some of the other triggers. Because usually when we're in a flare up, it's not just one thing. Usually there's a few different triggers that are happening and they're just all happening at the same time. And then it almost like it overflows the bucket. So the food helps. And then maybe there is mold, or maybe there's heavy metals, or maybe there's H. pylori or another type of gut bug. And as you're working on all of those, you could stay on a little bit of a stricter diet. And then as those things are gone, we can start to open it up because it is really, really important to open things up. I unfortunately have people who have been on a very restricted diet and they literally have like only 9 or 10 foods that they eat. And then 10 years later, doesn't help issues. And, we have to really start to very slowly open it up for them. But long term, you don't want to be so restricted.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I typically recommend elimination diet as well, and it's not a permanent elimination diet. Definitely want people to reintroduce foods. And so for those who are not or aren't as familiar with lectins, so like what foods like nightshades and
Mhm.
legumes and grains, do you like have people eliminate all those initially?
Initially, not for everyone, but for if they're in a flare up or we're trying to get things down, then yes. So it's grains, nightshade vegetables, which are going to be tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. And there are some other foods, like anything with seeds technically has lectins, so cucumbers and squashes, but those I feel like we can kind of be a little bit more lenient with. Plus, you could take the seeds out. So I'll scoop the seeds out of my cucumber and just eat the outside part, which is fine. Um, and beans also. But the trick is that if you pressure cook your beans, the lectins are destroyed, which is fantastic because beans obviously have some protein. They have a lot of good fiber. There's a lot of benefit there. So I have a pressure cooker. I always recommend to my clients to get one if they can. They're like $50 on Amazon and you can buy dried beans. You can soak them, not even for a long time, even for a couple of hours, and then put them in the pressure cooker and the lectins are gone and then you can enjoy them. And, it's just another way to add carbs because the problem is when you're taking out grains, you're very limited on carbs. And while some people can be on a very paleo like diet, depending on your metabolic rate, for some people, they don't do well with a high protein, high fat diet with no carbs. They may need the carbs. So then, those beans are a good way to put that in. I like things like sweet potato and cassava and, just to get some of those carbs for people that need them.
How do most of your clients deal with eggs, or how do they?
You
Do
know,
most people
so
do okay?
it depends. I feel like eggs aren't as biggie. Not to say that they can't be. This is where I like to test and see if there's an issue. And there's a couple of labs that I use. Sometimes I use the Egg Zoomer from Vibrant America. They look at both IgG and IgA, and they look at a lot of the different metabolites of the different proteins of the egg as it breaks down in the body. And then we could see. And some people are totally fine with it, and some people, like every single marker gets flagged. What about you?
Interesting.
What do you find with eggs?
Well, I agree with you that I mean, first of all, initially for a number of people, I do have people avoid the eggs as part of an elimination diet, but it's usually one of the first foods I'll have them reintroduce just because they're nutrient dense, and I find that a lot of people are able to tolerate them. I'd never heard of the egg zoomer. I heard of the wheat zoomer, so that's interesting. So there's just a test that focuses on the eggs.
Yep. So they have the wheat zoomer, the dairy zoomer, the egg zoomer. They have a nut zoomer, a grain zoomer. There's a seafood one. I think there's 9 or so.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know. I heard of the wheat zoomer, but was not familiar with. And the only
Mhm.
reason I was aware of it just because I've had a few patients do it. But honestly, that's Vibrant America, I think,
Yes.
is the
Mhm.
okay. Because I did look into them and maybe just didn't look enough to see the other zoomer tests. So that's pretty interesting with those tests. So, uh, anything else with food before we move into the next bucket?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of some of the, so I would say the gluten, dairy, lectins are probably my kind of go tos. I mean, with Hashimoto specifically, we also look at high iodine foods, which can be problematic. Especially initially, if there's a flare up. But, I think those are probably the biggest. And of course, obviously, sugar, no one really should be eating a lot of sugar that's in the processed form. So we try to limit that when we can. But I'll give you a personal example with my antibodies. My antibodies have gone up postpartum with both my kids, but much more so with my son because he was my first. There was a lot of stress, there was a lot of stuff going on. And I removed well, I've been gluten-free the whole time, so that didn't change. So I was gluten-free while I was pregnant with him, postpartum, but my antibodies shot up, very high. My thyroid peroxidase for Hashimoto's antibodies were over 1,000. At that point, the lab I was using didn't quantify, so I didn't know where they were, but it said over 1,000. And within a week of removing lectins, well, I shouldn't say lowering because you can't remove them all, but really, really lowering lectins, within 1 week, they were 600. So they went down 400 points, but who knows, maybe more because it was over 1,000. It could have been 1,200, right? It could have been 2,000. So there was a drastic improvement there. And I've seen that with a lot of people that I work with.
All right, now that's very cool, and thanks for sharing your experience with the lectins and how they affected your TPO antibodies. So, infections. What are some of the more common infections or microbes? Because like Candida, I don't really consider an infection. To me, it's more just of an overgrowth. Same thing with like SIBO. And again, I don't know if those would fall in the more common category. But yeah, let's hear what you find in your practice.
So, I mean, those things, if it's overgrown enough, can certainly create a stress on the body and on the immune system, create that immune system confusion. H. pylori is a biggie. I see that quite a bit. On the virus side of things, EBV is a really, really big one. I don't know if you find it as much in Graves, but in Hashimoto's, I think there's such a big relationship. And, just recently in the last couple of years with COVID, there's just been so much more Epstein-Barr reactivation. I've never seen this much reactivation ever in my practice in almost 20 years as I have in the last couple of years. Thankfully, there's a lot of things we can do with natural antiviral protocol and stress reduction that can really bring those viral loads down. But I think that's a big one. Um, Mold, Lyme. I see them often, but I think because a lot of the people that I see, and they're coming to me specifically for hypo and Hashimoto's, they might be coming from other practitioners that are more maybe general that they've seen. So they've already started to address some of that. So sometimes they've already had that handled before seeing me. Sometimes they haven't, and we address that. But those are definitely big ones as well.
Okay, so
What do
you
you
would
find?
consider. Oh, I find. Well, I mean, to me, Lyme, and I dealt with chronic Lyme, so to me, Lyme would be one of the more, at least from what I've seen, like uncommon, meaning that, and it's sometimes it's hard. Like Epstein Barr, to answer your question with Graves, yeah, most people just like Hashimoto's have Epstein Barr. Doesn't mean it's always a problem. And yeah, I agree with COVID. Since COVID happening, we see more reactivations, and then COVID itself, especially a few years ago, directly impacting people with both Graves and Hashimoto's. In my practice, I see more people with Graves, so I definitely saw a lot of people that seem to have it triggered with COVID. But yeah, viruses. I would say a common, even though again, I really think about viruses as more of a side effect because you mentioned stress, for example. I think of other things dragging down the immune system. And so, not to say I never use antivirals, but if that's all someone does, like if they all they do is put someone on an antiviral protocol, but they don't address the stress that we spoke about earlier, and if they're still eating anti-inflammatory diet, and if there's other things dragging down their immune system, then I don't think they're going to get optimal results. And can make the same argument with Lyme and other stealth infections. So yeah, I mean, with the Lyme and mold, it's funny because recently I interviewed Evan Brands, who I'm sure
Mhm.
you're familiar with, and he was saying in his practice, and again, he focuses a lot more on mold, but like 80-90% of people. And again, I can't say I've seen that in my practice as far as at least being a factor in autoimmunity, like where I've addressed the mold and needed to address the mold for people to get into remission. So again, as far as my clientele, I don't know if I would say that's, to me, it would be Lyme and mold. I don't want to say rare, but I wouldn't say, I don't think I would classify it as some of the, as one of the more common causes. The infections, yeah, like H. pylori, definitely see a lot of people with H. pylori. Uh, Parasites, definitely a little bit controversial. I do see parasites, but it's one of those things where the stool tests are definitely not perfect. So you could have false
Mhm.
negatives, and then you could have the opposite where you could have a parasite and it's not a problem. And sometimes it's hard to know if it is a problem or if it's not a problem. But yeah, I would say when it comes to infections, the gut microbes more common from what I see with especially like the Graves patients, and viruses. And I do see it like SIBO. You would figure more common with Hashimoto's because I mean there's numerous causes of SIBO, but when you have lower thyroid hormone, that could also affect the migrating motor complex. But
Sure.
again, I see a fair amount of people with hyperthyroidism who also have SIBO. Obviously different mechanism as far as what causes SIBO, but SIBO, candida overgrowth, I would say common. So yeah, I would say those are more common. The stealth infections like Lyme, Bartonella, um, again, maybe they're there, and just because I don't test everybody for them, and then because we're improving the health of other areas, they just kind of, again, it's almost like I said, a side effect where we
Mhm.
help with that. And like I said, mold, I definitely see, and I see more of that now than I did years ago. But I still wouldn't rank it like in like the top three when even though technically, I guess I don't know if you really would classify it as an infection. I mean, it's to me, I think of it with the mycotoxins more of an
More of a
environmental
toxin
toxin
really than
issue.
an infection. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but how
Yeah.
common do you see stealth infections and mold? Do you see a lot of that in your practice?
I mean, I do, but also I'm in the Northeast, so we're like Lime country here. So I think it's more I mean, it's common everywhere, but I think possibly maybe it's a little bit more common here. I don't test every single person for it just because the testing is really expensive. So it just depends on their history and if it warrants testing. But I think what you said though also is that it's all about looking at it as a whole, right? And so usually it's not one trigger, right? It's usually 5, 6, 7 triggers. Now, can you get to all 7 triggers? Maybe, maybe not, right? But if you think of it as this bucket, right? And if there's 7 triggers and the bucket is this full, if we take out 3 of the triggers and work on the stress, now the bucket is half full. Can the immune system get to a point where it can kind of work on some of the others on its own? Maybe, possibly. I'd like to think so, really. So sometimes it's not about figuring out every little thing. And this is where I think people, it's a very fine line, right? So I really see myself as a health detective, and I know you really do as well, right? I mean, the work that we do, like we're trying to put this puzzle piece together. And so we want to look at all the different pieces and how they fit. And in some cases we could see it and it's very specific, but in other cases it's a little bit more vague. And so we do what we can. And then we really that's like that lowering of the nervous system, that down regulation that we help hopefully the client or the patient do. And then their body can take care of the rest.
Definitely agree. And I also don't test everybody for Lyme, but do you test everybody for mold? Like, do you do a urinary mycotox test on everybody?
No, not everybody. Now again, if they have a history of living in a place that had water damage, and also, and with mold, you don't necessarily have to have respiratory symptoms, But, for people that do and it just, like the sinus stuff and, I just kind of if I feel that there's something there in their history sort of matches that, then we do. But, the mycotoxin test is a little bit kind of iffy too because the foods we eat also produce mycotoxins. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's the environment, but either way, if it's there, we work on changing the diet and we work on, just make sure that they have clean air and live in a place where um, there's less moisture in general.
Yeah, agree. And yeah, that's a good point that just because you have a positive finding on a urinary mycotoxin test doesn't mean it's coming from the air. It could be coming from the food that you eat. So I'm glad you brought that up. And are you familiar with medical diagnostic laboratories, MDL?
They do the Lyme testing, right? They're one of the Lyme testing.
Yeah, because they're
Lab-
not too bad. You're probably familiar with IGeneX, which is
yeah,
the
hygienics.
standard, and I know they're kind of pricey, but
Very. I just did one for my
yeah.
son. It was $1,400.
Yeah. So again, they're the gold standard for a lot of practitioners. But when I was dealing with chronic Lyme, I was thinking about IGeneX, and I worked with a Lyme literate practitioner at the time. And so she mentioned, well, we could do the IGeneX, but let's do the MDL first, which looks at Lyme, it looks at Bartonella, looks at other co-infections, and it sure enough, it picked up the Lyme, it picked up the Bartonella, and it was a couple of $100s. So
Yeah,
again,
no, it's much
something
more
it's
affordable.
yeah, yeah, still something I don't do on everybody, but if I'm suspecting it, usually that's what at least the first thing I'll look at. If it's negative and we're still suspecting something, then you could always consider the IGeneX, but just figured I'd bring that up.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And then chemicals. I know we touched upon the chemicals with the mercury. Are there other common chemicals that you see, other heavy metals? I don't know if you test for heavy metals or other
Yeah.
environmental
Mhm.
toxins.
So I do sometimes I use the mercury test or the heavy metals from Quicksilver. They do a nice metal test. I do hair testing a lot also. I don't think that hair testing is really the best for metals just because some people just don't excrete things and hair testing it shows you what you do excrete. But what I find is that after a few hair tests, if you do one every 6 months and you start to do a little detox, you'll see them come up if they're there. And I also like hair testing, of course, for the mineral levels, but also for copper. And that's something I find more so in women, I would say, than men, though, I do see it in everyone. And copper is an essential mineral, but when it's higher than optimal, it almost acts as a metal. That's something that I've dealt with. And it can really have a lot of different symptoms and relate to a lot of different things. And high copper, because of high copper, you can have low zinc. And for thyroid, especially, zinc is so important for so many different things, as well as immune system too. So I like to rule that out.
Yeah, I like hair testing too, and I agree with the copper. And that's something that you can't always, it doesn't always correlate with the blood. You might see copper
Oh,
toxicity on the hair and the blood
exactly.
might look good. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
all right. Do you test for adrenals? Get into the stress components. Do you do any salivary testing or dried urine testing? Or
So I'll do a Dutch, not on everyone, but some people. I used to test adrenals much more. I find that I mean, unless I'm really kind of wondering, okay, is the cortisol low at night or is it high at night? But for most people, I can kind of tell just from what they tell me in their health history. And I really put in a lot of the mind body techniques from the beginning. And then I find that and then especially if someone doesn't have an unlimited budget, that wouldn't be a test where I would allocate budget if we really need to find a specific bug, because that we can't know this, I almost can kind of tell. But I do use a Dutch sometimes, a Dutch complete. Lately, I've been using a lot of the cycle mapping test from my perimenopause women just because that can create a lot of shifts very quickly in the body. And I have a couple of adrenal formulas that I'll use, but I have to say over the years, myself personally, and then in my practice, I'm using less and less adrenal stuff, if you will, and herbs, and really going more towards the mind body. I used to try to depend on, oh, let me take some ashwagandha, let me take this. I'm feeling a little low. And yes, they help, but I feel like it's still a little bit of a band aid. And I mean, some of the adaptogens are good, of course, because they do sort of help to balance, but it's still nothing compared to what we can do with our minds. And, taking an adrenal supplement when we're going crazy, stressing about it, it's like, we have the big elephant and it's like this little tiny bird that we're trying to give to the person, versus addressing the big pink elephant in the room.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I like adaptogenic herbs, and I think they have their place, and other herbs like more calming herbs as well, sometimes for adrenals. But I agree that it's not a substitute. If you had to choose one, you definitely would want to choose the lifestyle, the stress management, the perception of stress, the mind body medicine that we discussed earlier, along with diet, along with sleep. All those are, I mean, again, there's a time and place for supplements, and I recommend
Yeah.
supplements. But if we had to choose between one or the other, and I mean, because I'm sure you see it too, where someone walks into your, or even if you work remotely,
Mm.
you Zoom with them, and they have 20 or 30 different supplements, for
Yeah.
the very first consultation, and they're not eating an ideal diet. They're not, doing a good job of managing stress. So yeah, I definitely would rather see the opposite. Uh, as far as, if we had to choose between one or the other.
Yeah, yeah. The one supplement I do use if I see high cortisol or suspect it, I'll use phosphatidylserine just because I think it's so calming and people really feel a difference, especially the people who wake up in the middle of the night between 1 and 4 a.m. and stay awake, excuse me, for more than 15 minutes where it's hard to fall asleep. That really helps. So I use that a lot. But some of the herbs also I found for myself personally, too many herbs just don't work well for my body. Like I'll either break out or it'll just be, and I think with autoimmunity, in general, herbs are, of course, are wonderful, but we just don't know, like, they can stimulate more TH1 versus TH2. And I mean, I know there's certain studies sort of say, "Okay, this is more TH1, this is more TH2," but how do we really know what we are? It changes with our immune system, so it's not always gonna be the same, and so I just, in general, tend to err a little bit more on the side of caution with herbs for autoimmunity for that reason, even though some of them may not have a specific study or may not have, anything that people will say, "Oh, this is not good for Hashimoto's or for Graves." I've just seen it myself and with some of my sensitive people. I have a lot of really sensitive people, that I work with, so that's why I'm a little more careful with those as well.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So, are there anything else you want to cover? Anything else that's more common or uncommon that we didn't really talk about?
So here's one that is, uncommon, but maybe common, and with Hashimoto's specifically, and possibly maybe with Graves also. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, but, Botox. So it's very, very popular. And, even, for people who are more into functional medicine, they always say, well, I wouldn't want to put a toxin in my body, but they do it anyway, right? We all do. Um, and we know that it's a toxin and your liver is going to process it. But it's interesting. There is a study that showed that it actually can affect, the way the immune system works and affect the thyroid. Um, it was more specific with Hashimoto's antibodies going up. I don't know about Graves. I'm curious if you had any experience with that, but that's always something that I tell people about, and I'll say, listen, like it's your choice, of course. I can't tell you what to do, but it's something you probably, you know, may not have heard of from your dermatologist or whoever does the Botox, and it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I am familiar with the research, and yeah, there's nothing I've seen related to Graves. And yeah, I don't think I have seen anyone in my practice where that has been a trigger, or if it was, maybe I missed it. But again, yeah, I would agree that's probably, if it is a trigger in those with Graves as well, it would be a lesser common trigger. Um,
It
maybe
just
also for,
depends. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say it depends also on what else is going on, right? Like if there's a lot of other stuff, this could be that little bit that skews, them over the edge, possibly.
yeah, no, I agree. And I was gonna say one maybe lesser common trigger as well, and I'll get your feedback after I say it, breast implants. So I think it could
Yeah,
be a trigger, and I've seen it, but it's not like 50% or even 20-30% of my population has breast implants as being a trigger. So I don't know if
right.
you've seen that in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have very many people with them that I know of, but I have a few people who've taken them out just thinking that it was creating issues for them. But I don't think I have a big enough pool to really kind of speak as well about it. But there's certainly a huge movement, with taking them out and just the different health implications, whether that's autoimmunity or toxicity or other things like that. But I think in general, anything that creates toxicity, right, is going to have a possible effect on autoimmunity depending on what our pathways are doing.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, and actually, just speaking of beauty stuff, another thing that can be a trigger for some people is fillers, but specific types of fillers. I actually interviewed a dermatologist who was a little bit more functional, and she was saying that the cross-linking fillers, so like Voluma, and I forget the brands of everything else, but it's the ones that they cross-link so they stay in the body longer. So it's like hyaluronic acid that they cross-link with something else. I'm not sure the exact her exact wording, but she feels like there could be something with that. So if someone does get fillers, maybe asking the person who does your fillers if this filler that you're using is a cross-linking one or not.
Interesting. All right, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that as well, Ina. And anything else that you want to share, or anything that I should have asked you that I
Mm.
didn't ask you that you want to talk about? Or if you want to just summarize, kind of like, just to go over, just to give a brief summary of some of the things that you mentioned.
Of course, yes. So I think when you're dealing with autoimmunity, it's really about looking at it from a whole body perspective. So, whether it's Graves or Hashimoto's or any autoimmune disease, of course, there's going to be nuances, right, of what we do. But I think a lot of those are more specific even to addressing the thyroid function itself, right? So, the things you do, obviously, for Graves are going to be, or hyperthyroid are going to be different than what you would do for hypo. And then if you do have hypo, there's a lot of different thyroid types, as I call them. So, um, what I find is when you're dealing with thyroid autoimmunity, it's really this sort of twofold approach of supporting the autoimmunity, right? While at the same time supporting thyroid function. Obviously, again, it's different that how we would support it for hyper than hypo, but you just want to make sure that you are really doing that and really supporting it for you and really looking at those optimal ranges of where you want to be while you are doing all of the things to help to balance the immune system. And, I like to look at the immune system as this, very intelligent thing that knows what to do. However, when bombarded with a lot of different things, kind of naturally loses its footing a little bit. And so it's not about, oh no, my immune system is kaput. Because people say my immune system is shot or my thyroid is shot. And it's like, no, we don't want to say that. Like your body is so intelligent and it's so amazing. It's just clogged with all these different things. So it's not about let's get rid of everything because we sometimes don't even know what it is, but it's like, let's calm it. And that's why that nervous system, so we talk about, so important. And I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm going to say it again, like anything you can do on a daily basis to be proactive, because you want to make sure that you're kind of being in a place of balancing and relating in the body versus reacting, right? You don't want to react to a stress. You want to be ready for it to come. And when it comes, you can handle that versus reacting afterwards. And so the calmer the nervous system, the better your immune system is going to function. And the more of these other triggers that you take out, it almost like think of it as taking just the burden off. Like think of this intelligent being, which is your immune system. And it's got like, I almost imagine it is like walking in ski boots, but not on the ski slope, right? It's really, really hard. So if you're like, hey, let me give you a hand, let me take this boot off, let me take this boot off, let me like show you a little bit of how we could do it easier. The immune system is like, oh my gosh, okay, cool. Now I can do this. So, it's not about rewiring it. It's just like slowing things down enough and helping it along so it can kind of come back and do its job and not be so hyper vigilant, because we don't want to be in that state of let me shoot now, ask later. And that's what happens in most cases with autoimmunity.
All right, very well said. And where can people find out more about you, Ina? Definitely bring up your podcast again, your website, anything else. I think you have a program also for Hashimoto's.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the best way to connect with me actually is on Instagram. I'm at Inna Topiler there. My podcast is healthmysteriessolved.com. And there's all of the information about that there. And then I do also have a Hashimoto's program for those listening who have Hashimoto's, where we get into that support and specific thyroid support. And we made a special link for you guys. It's thyroidmysterysolved.com/Dr. Eric. So it's just Dr. Eric for that. But yeah, the best way to connect with me is through Instagram. I answer all my messages and happy to connect.
All right, wonderful. Of course, I'll make sure to put those links in the show notes, and thank you so much for this conversation. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm sure the audience learns a lot during this chat about common and uncommon causes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to connect with you again.